Meister Eckhart. Eckhart von Hochheim OP, commonly known as Meister Eckhart or Eckehart, was a German theologian, philosopher, and mystic, born near Gotha, in the Landgraviate of Thuringia in the Holy Roman Empire. Eckhart came into prominence during the Avignon papacy, at a time of increased tensions between monastic orders, diocesan clergy, the Franciscan order, and Eckhart's Dominican order of preachers. In later life, he was accused of heresy and brought up before the local Franciscan-led Inquisition, and tried as a heretic by Pope John XXII. He seems to have died before his verdict was received. He was well known for his work with pious lay groups such as the Friends of God and was succeeded by his more circumspect disciples John Tauler and Henry Sisso. Since the 19th century, he has received renewed attention. He has acquired a status as a great mystic within contemporary popular spirituality, as well as considerable interest from scholars situating him within the medieval scholastic and philosophical tradition. Eckhart was probably born in the village of Tombake, near Gotha, in the Landgraviate of Thuringia, perhaps between 1250 and 1260. It was previously asserted that he was born to a noble family of landowners, but this originated in a misinterpretation of the archives of the period. In reality, little is known about his family and early life. There is no authority for giving him the Christian name of Johannes, which sometimes appears in biographical sketches. His Christian name was Eckhart, his surname was von Hochheim. Eckhart joined the Dominicans at Erfurt, probably when he was about 18, and it is assumed he studied at Cologne. He may have also studied at the University of Paris, either before or after his time in Cologne. The first solid evidence we have for his life is when on 18 April 1294, as a baccalaureus on the sentences of Peter Lombard, a post to which he had presumably been appointed in 1293, he preached the Easter sermon at the Dominican convent of Saint Jacques in Paris. In late 1294, Eckhart was made prior at Erfurt and provincial of Thuringia. His earliest vernacular work, Reden der Unterweisung, a series of talks delivered to Dominican novices, dates from this time. In 1302, he was sent to Paris to take up the external Dominican chair of theology. He remained there until 1303. The short Parisian questions date from this time. In late 1303 Eckhart returned to Erfurt, and was made provincial for Saxony, a province which reached at that time from the Netherlands to Livonia. He therefore had responsibility for 47 convents in this region. Complaints made against him and the provincial of Teutonia at the General Chapter held in Paris in 1306, concerning irregularities among the turneries, must have been trivial, because the general, Imeric of Piacenza, appointed him in the following year his vicar general for Bohemia with full power to set the demoralized monasteries there in order. Eckhart was provincial for Saxony until 1311, during which time he founded 3 convents for women there. On May 14, 1311 Eckhart was appointed by the General Chapter held at Naples as teacher at Paris. To be invited back to Paris for a second stint as magister was a rare privilege, previously granted only to Thomas Aquinas. Eckhart stayed in Paris for 2 academic years, until the summer of 1313, living in the same house as William of Paris. Then follows a long period of which it is known only that he spent part of the time at Strasbourg. It is unclear what specific office he held there. He seems chiefly to have been concerned with spiritual direction and with preaching in convents of Dominicans. A passage in a chronicle of the year 1320, extant in manuscript, speaks of a prior Eckhart at Frankfurt who was suspected of heresy, and some have referred this to Meister Eckhart. It is unusual that a man under suspicion of heresy would have been appointed teacher in one of the most famous schools of the order, but Eckhart's distinctive expository style could well have already been under scrutiny by his Franciscan detractors. In late 1323 or early 1324, Eckhart left Strasbourg for the Dominican house at Cologne. It is not clear exactly what he did here, though part of his time may have been spent teaching at the prestigious studium in the city. Eckhart also continued to preach, addressing his sermons during a time of disarray among the clergy and monastic orders, rapid growth of numerous pious lay groups, and the Inquisition's continuing concerns over heretical movements throughout Europe. It appears that some of the Dominican authorities already had concerns about Eckhart's teaching. The Dominican General Chapter held in Venice in the spring of 1325 had spoken out against friars in Teutonia who say things in their sermons that can easily lead simple and uneducated people into error. This concern may have been why Nicholas of Strasbourg, to whom the Pope had in 1325 given the temporary charge of the Dominican friaries in Germany, conducted an investigation of Eckhart's orthodoxy. Nicholas presented a list of suspect passages from the Book of Consolation to Eckhart, who responded sometime between August 1325 and January 1326 with a lost treatise Requisitus, which satisfied his immediate superiors of his orthodoxy. Despite this assurance, however, the Archbishop in 1326 ordered an inquisitorial process. At this point he issued a vindicatory document providing chapter and verse of what he had been taught. Throughout the difficult months of late 1326, Eckhart had the full support of the local Dominican authorities, as evident in Nicholas of Strasbourg's 3 official protests against the actions of the inquisitors in January 1327. On 13 February 1327, before the Archbishop's inquisitors pronounced their sentence on Eckhart, Eckhart preached a sermon in the Dominican church at Cologne, and then had his secretary read out a public protestation of his innocence. He stated in his protest that he had always detested everything wrong, and should anything of the kind be found in his writings, he now retracts. Eckhart himself translated the text into German, so that his audience, the vernacular public, could understand it. The verdict then seems to have gone against Eckhart. Eckhart denied competence and authority to the inquisitors and the archbishop, and appealed to the pope against the verdict. He then, in the spring of 1327, set off for Avignon. In Avignon, Pope John XXII seems to have set up 2 tribunals to inquire into the case, one of theologians and the other of cardinals. Evidence of this process is thin. However, it is known that the commissions reduced the 150 suspect articles down to 28. The document known as the Votum Avignonense gives, in scholastic fashion, the 28 articles, Eckhart's defense of each, and the rebuttal of the commissioners. On 30 April 1328, the Pope wrote to Archbishop Henry of Werniberg that the case against Eckhart was moving ahead, but added that Eckhart had already died. The Papal Commission eventually confirmed the decision of the Cologne Commission against Eckhart. Pope John XXII issued a bull, 27 March 1329, in which a series of statements from Eckhart is characterized as heretical, another as suspected of heresy. At the close, it is stated that Eckhart recanted before his death everything which he had falsely taught, by subjecting himself and his writing to the decision of the Apostolic See. It is possible that the Pope's unusual decision to issue the bull, despite the death of Eckhart, was due to the Pope's fear of the growing problem of mystical heresy, and pressure from his ally Henry II to bring the case to a definite conclusion. Eckhart's status in the contemporary Catholic Church has been uncertain. The Dominican order pressed in the last decade of the 20th century for his full rehabilitation and confirmation of his theological orthodoxy. Pope John Paul II voiced favorable opinion on this initiative, even going as far as quoting from Eckhart's writings, but the affair is still confined to the corridors of the Vatican. In the spring of 2010, it was revealed that there was finally a response from the Vatican in a letter dated 1992. Timothy Radcliffe, then Master of the Dominicans and recipient of the letter, summarized the contents as follows. We tried to have the censure lifted on Eckhart and were told that there was really no need since he had never been condemned by name, just some propositions which he was supposed to have held, and so we are perfectly free to say that he is a good and orthodox theologian. Professor Winfried Truson of Würzburg, a correspondent of Radcliffe, wrote in part of a defense of Eckhart to Cardinal Ratzinger, stating, "Only 28 propositions were censured, but they were taken out of their context and impossible to verify, since there were no manuscripts in Avignon. Eckhart was schooled in medieval scholasticism and was well acquainted with Aristotelianism, Augustinianism, and Neoplatonism. Although he was an accomplished academic theologian, Eckhart's best remembered works are his highly unusual sermons in the vernacular. Eckhart as a preaching friar attempted to guide his flock, as well as monks and nuns under his jurisdiction, with practical sermons on spiritual/psychological transformation and New Testament metaphorical content related to the creative power inherent in disinterest. The central theme of Eckhart's German sermons is the presence of God in the individual soul, and the dignity of the soul of the just man. Although he elaborated on this theme, he rarely departed from it. In one sermon, Eckhart gives the following summary of his message. "When I preach, I usually speak of detachment and say that a man should be empty of self and all things, and secondly, that he should be reconstructed in the simple good that God is, and thirdly, that he should consider the great aristocracy which God has set up in the soul, such that by means of it man may wonderfully attain to God, and fourthly, of the purity of the divine nature." As Eckhart said in his trial defense, his sermons were meant to inspire in listeners the desire above all to do some good. In this, he frequently used unusual language or seemed to stray from the path of orthodoxy, which made him suspect to the Church during the tense years of the Avignon papacy. In Eckhart's vision, God is primarily fecund. Out of overabundance of love the fertile God gives birth to the Son, the Word in all of us. Clearly, this is rooted in the Neoplatonic notion of ebullience, boiling over of the one that cannot hold back its abundance of being. Eckhart had imagined the creation not as a compulsory overflowing, but as the free act of will of the triune nature of deity. Another bold assertion is Eckhart's distinction between God and Godhead. These notions had been present in Pseudo-Dionysius's writings and John the Scott's De Divisione Naturae, but Eckhart, with characteristic vigor and audacity, reshaped the germinal metaphors into profound images of polarity between the unmanifest and manifest absolute. John Orme Mills notes that Eckhart did not leave us a guide to the spiritual life like Saint Bonaventure's Itinerarium, the journey of the soul, but that his ideas on this have to be condensed from his couple of very short books on suffering and detachment and sermons. According to Mills, Eckhart's comments on prayer are only about contemplative prayer detachment. Eckhart was one of the most influential 13th-century Christian Neoplatonists in his day, and remained widely read in the later Middle Ages. Some early 20th-century writers believed that Eckhart's work was forgotten by his fellow Dominicans soon after his death. In 1960, however, a manuscript was discovered containing 600 excerpts from Eckhart, clearly deriving from an original made in the Cologne Dominican convent after the promulgation of the bull condemning Eckhart's writings, as notations from the bull are inserted into the manuscript. The manuscript came into the possession of the Carthusians in Basel, demonstrating that some Dominicans and Carthusians had continued to read Eckhart's work. It is also clear that Nicholas of Cusa, Archbishop of Cologne in the 1430s and 1440s, engaged in extensive study of Eckhart. He assembled, and carefully annotated, a surviving collection of Eckhart's Latin works. As Eckhart was the only medieval theologian tried before the Inquisition as a heretic, the subsequent condemnation of excerpts from his works cast a shadow over his reputation for some, but followers of Eckhart in the lay group Friends of God existed in communities across the region and carried on his ideas under the leadership of such priests as John Tauler and Henry Sisso. Eckhart is considered by some to have been the inspirational layman referred to in Johannes Tauler's and Roman Merswin's later writings in Strasbourg, where he is known to have spent time. On the other hand, most scholars consider the layman to be a pure fiction invented by Merswin to hide his authorship because of the intimidating tactics of the Inquisition at the time. It has been suspected that his practical communication of the mystical path is behind the influential 14th-century anonymous Theologia Germanica, which was disseminated after his disappearance. According to the medieval introduction of the document, its author was an unnamed member of the Teutonic Order of Knights living in Frankfurt. The lack of imprimatur from the Church and anonymity of the author of the Theologia Germanica did not lessen its influence for the next 2 centuries, including Martin Luther at the peak of public and clerical resistance to Catholic indulgences, and was viewed by some historians of the early 20th century as pivotal in provoking Luther's actions and the subsequent Protestant Reformation. The following quote from the Theologia Germanica depicts the conflict between worldly and ecclesiastical affairs. The two eyes of the soul of man cannot both perform their work at once, but if the soul shall see with the right eye into eternity, then the left eye must close itself and refrain from working, and be as though it were dead. For if the left eye be fulfilling its office toward outward things, that is holding converse with time and the creatures, then must the right eye be hindered in its working, that is, in its contemplation. Therefore, whosoever will have the one must let the other go, for no man can serve two masters. Eckhart was largely forgotten from the 16th to the 19th centuries, barring occasional interest from thinkers such as Angelus Silesius. For centuries, none of Eckhart's writings were known except a number of sermons, found in the old editions of Johann Tauler's sermons, published by Kakeluen and by Adam Petrie. Interest in Eckhart's works was revived in the early 19th century, especially by German romantics and idealist philosophers. Franz Pfeiffer's publication in 1857 of Eckhart's German sermons and treatises added greatly to this interest. A second important figure in the later 19th century for the recovery of Eckhart's works was Heinrich Sius Denifl, who was the first to recover Eckhart's Latin works, from 1886 onwards. During the late 19th and early 20th century, much Catholic interest in Eckhart was concerned with the consistency of his thought in relation to neoscholastic thought. In other words, to see whether Eckhart's thought could be seen to be essentially in conformity with orthodoxy as represented by his fellow Dominican Thomas Aquinas. Since the mid-19th century, scholars have questioned which of the many pieces attributed to Eckhart should be considered genuine, and whether greater weight should be given to works written in the vernacular, or Latin. Although the vernacular works survive today in over 200 manuscripts, the Latin writings are only found in a handful of manuscripts. Denifl and others have proposed that the Latin treatises, which Eckhart prepared for publication very carefully, were essential to a full understanding of Eckhart. In 1923, Eckhart's Essential Sermons, Commentaries, Treatises, and Defense was republished. The defense recorded Eckhart's responses against two of the inquisitional proceedings brought against him at Cologne, and details of the circumstances of Eckhart's trial. The excerpts in the defense from vernacular sermons and treatises described by Eckhart as his own, served to authenticate a number of the vernacular works. Although questions remain about the authenticity of some vernacular works, there is no dispute about the genuine character of the Latin texts presented in the critical edition. Since the 1960s, debate has been going on in Germany whether Eckhart should be called a mystic. The philosopher Karl Albert had already argued that Eckhart had to be placed in the tradition of philosophical mysticism of Parmenides, Plato, Plotinus, Porphyry, Proclus, and other Neoplatonistic thinkers. Harry Bert Fisher argued in the 1960s that Eckhart was a medieval theologian. Kurt Flasch, a member of the so-called Bochum school of medieval philosophy, strongly reacted against the influence of New Age mysticism and all kinds of emotional subjective mysticism, arguing for the need to free Eckhart from the mystical flood. He sees Eckhart strictly as a philosopher. Flasch argues that the opposition between mystic and scholastic is not relevant because this mysticism is penetrated by the spirit of the university, in which it occurred. According to Hackett, Eckhart is to be understood as an original hermeneutical thinker in the Latin tradition. To understand Eckhart, he has to be properly placed within the Western philosophical tradition of which he was a part. Josiah Royce, an objective idealist, saw Eckhart as a representative example of 13th and 14th century Catholic mystics on the verge of pronounced heresy but without original philosophical opinions. Royce attributes Eckhart's reputation for originality to the fact that he translated scholastic philosophy from Latin into German, and that Eckhart wrote about his speculations in German instead of Latin. Eckhart generally followed Thomas Aquinas's doctrine of the Trinity, but Eckhart exaggerated the scholastic distinction between the divine essence and the divine persons. The very heart of Eckhart's speculative mysticism, according to Royce, is that if, through what is called in Christian terminology the procession of the Son, the divine omniscience gets a complete expression in eternal terms, still there is even at the center of this omniscience the necessary mystery of the divine essence itself, which neither generates nor is generated, and which is yet the source and fountain of all the divine. The Trinity is, for Eckhart, the revealed God, and the mysterious origin of the Trinity is the Godhead, the absolute God. Matthew Fox is an American theologian. Formerly a priest and a member of the Dominican order within the Roman Catholic Church, Fox was an early and influential exponent of a movement that came to be known as creation spirituality. The movement draws inspiration from the wisdom traditions of Christian scriptures, and the philosophies of such medieval Catholic visionaries as Hildegard of Bingen, Thomas Aquinas, Saint Francis of Assisi, Julian of Norwich, Dante Alighieri, Meister Eckhart, and Nicholas of Cusa, and others. Fox has written a number of articles on Eckhart, and a book titled Breakthrough, Meister Eckhart's Creation Spirituality in New Translation. The French philosopher Jacques Derrida distinguishes Eckhart's negative theology from his own concept of difference, although John D. Caputo in his influential The Tears and Prayers of Jacques Derrida emphasizes the importance of that tradition for this thought. Meister Eckhart has become one of the timeless heroes of modern spirituality, which thrives on an all-inclusive syncretism. This syncretism started with the colonization of Asia, and the search of similarities between Eastern and Western religions. Western monotheism was projected onto Eastern religiosity by Western Orientalists, trying to accommodate Eastern religiosity to a Western understanding, whereafter Asian intellectuals used these projections as a starting point to propose the superiority of those Eastern religions. Early on, the figure of Meister Eckhart has played a role in these developments and exchanges. Renewed academic attention to Eckhart has attracted favorable attention to his work from contemporary non-Christian mystics. Eckhart's most famous single quote, "The eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me," is commonly cited by thinkers within Neopaganism and Ultimatist Buddhism as a point of contact between these traditions and Christian mysticism. The first translation of Upanishads appeared in two parts in 1801 and 1802. The 19th-century philosopher Schopenhauer was influenced by the early translations of the Upanishads, which he called the consolation of my life. Schopenhauer compared Eckhart's views to the teachings of Indian, Christian, and Islamic mystics and ascetics. If we turn from the forms, produced by external circumstances, and go to the root of things, we shall find that Sakyamuni and Meister Eckhart teach the same thing, only that the former dared to express his ideas plainly and positively, whereas Eckhart is obliged to clothe them in the garment of the Christian myth, and to adapt his expressions thereto. Schopenhauer also stated, "Buddha, Eckhart, and I all teach essentially the same." A major force in the mutual influence of Eastern and Western ideas and religiosity was the Theosophical Society, which also incorporated Eckhart in its notion of theosophy. It searched for ancient wisdom in the East, spreading Eastern religious ideas in the West. One of its salient features was the belief in masters of wisdom, beings, human or once human, who have transcended the normal frontiers of knowledge, and who make their wisdom available to others. The Theosophical Society also spread Western ideas in the East, aiding a modernization of Eastern traditions, and contributing to a growing nationalism in the Asian colonies. The Theosophical Society had a major influence on Hindu reform movements. A major proponent of this Neo-Hinduism, also called Neo-Vedanta, was Vivekananda, who popularized his modernized interpretation of Advaita Vedanta in the 19th and early 20th century in both India and the West, emphasizing Anubhava over scriptural authority. Vivekananda's teachings have been compared to Eckhart's teachings. In the 20th century, Eckhart's thoughts were also compared to Shankara's Advaita Vedanta by Rudolf Otto in his Mysticism East and West. According to King, the aim of this work was to redeem Eckhart's mysticism in Protestant circles, attempting to establish the superiority of the German mysticism of Eckhart over the Indian mysticism of Sankara. The Theosophical Society also had a major influence on Buddhist modernism, and the spread of this modernized Buddhism in the West. Along with H.S. Alcott and Anagarika Dharmapala, Helena P. Blavatsky was instrumental in the Western transmission and revival of Theravada Buddhism. In 1891, Carl Eugen Neumann, who translated large parts of the Tripitaka, found parallels between Eckhart and Buddhism, which he published in Zwei Buddhistische Suttas und ein Traktat Meister Eckharts. D.T. Suzuki, who joined the Theosophical Society Adyar and was an active theosophist, discerned parallels between Eckhart's teachings and Zen Buddhism in his mysticism Christian and Buddhist, drawing similarities between Eckhart's pure nothingness and sunyata. Shizutaru Ueda, a third-generation Kyoto school philosopher and scholar in medieval philosophy, showed similarities between Eckhart's soteriology and Zen Buddhism in an article. Rainer Sherman, a professor of philosophy, while agreeing with Daisa's T. Suzuki that there exist certain similarities between Zen Buddhism and Meister Eckhart's teaching, also disputed Suzuki's contention that the ideas expounded in Eckhart's sermons closely approach Buddhist thought, so closely indeed, that one could stamp them almost definitely as coming out of Buddhist speculations. Sherman's several clarifications included: the notable humanistic psychoanalyst and philosopher Erich Fromm was another scholar who brought renewed attention in the West to Eckhart's writings, drawing upon many of the latter's themes in his large corpus of work. Eckhart was a significant influence in developing United Nations Secretary-General Dag Hammarskjöld's conception of spiritual growth through selfless service to humanity, as detailed in his book of contemplations called Vagmarken. In Ion, Researches into the Phenomenology of Self, Carl G. Jung cites Eckhart approvingly in his discussion of Christ as a symbol of the archetypal self. Jung sees Eckhart as a Christian Gnostic. Meister Eckhart's theology knows a Godhead of which no qualities, except unity and being, can be predicated. It is becoming, it is not yet Lord of itself, and it represents an absolute coincidence of opposites, but its simple nature is of forms formless, of becoming becomingless, of beings beingless, of things thingless, etc. Union of opposites is equivalent to unconsciousness, so far as human logic goes, for consciousness presupposes a differentiation into subject and object and a relation between them. As the Godhead is essentially unconscious, so too is the man who lives in God. In his sermon on the poor in spirit, the Meister says, "The man who has this poverty has everything he was when he lived not in any wise, neither in himself, nor in truth, nor in God. He is so quit and empty of all knowing that no knowledge of God is alive in him, for while he stood in the eternal nature of God, there lived in him not another, what lived there was himself. And so we say this man is as empty of his own knowledge as he was when he was not anything, he lets God work with what he will, and he stands empty as when he came from God. Therefore he should love God in the following way, love him as he is, a not God, a not spirit, a not person, a not image, as a sheer, pure, clear one, which he is, sundered from all secondness, and in this one let us sink eternally, from nothing to nothing. So help us God. Amen." Jung summed up his view of Eckhart saying, "The world-embracing spirit of Meister Eckhart knew, without discursive knowledge, the primordial mystical experience of India as well as of the Gnostics, and was itself the finest flower on the tree of the free spirit that flourished at the beginning of the 11th century. Well might the writings of this master be buried for 600 years, for his time was not yet come. Only in the 19th century did he find a public at all capable of appreciating the grandeur of his mind." In Jacob's Ladder, Lewis, the main character's friend, attributes the following quote to Eckhart. "You know what he said? The only thing that burns in hell is the part of you that won't let go of your life, your memories, your attachments. They burn 'em all away. But they're not punishing you," he said. "They're freeing your soul. If you're frightened of dying and holding on, you'll see devils tearing your life away. But if you've made your peace, then the devils are really angels, freeing you from the earth." In Z213, Exit, by Dimitris Lyakos, the same quote attributed to Eckhart, appears in a slightly different wording. "Your own are burning and your memories, and you don't want to leave them. Everything will burn to the end, you suffer, but nobody is punishing you, they are just setting your soul free. Don't be afraid, because while you fear death they will rend your soul like demons. Only calm down and you will see the angels who are setting you free, and then you will be free." In the book The Gargoyle by Andrew Davidson, Eckhart is mentioned in a story Marianne Engel recounts to the protagonist about her days in the Engelthal monastery. Meister Eckhart would not even admit that God was good. Eckhart's position was that anything that was good can become better, and whatever may become better may become best. God cannot be referred to as good, better, or best because he is above all things. If a man says that God is wise, the man is lying because anything that is wise can become wiser. Anything that a man might say about God is incorrect, even calling him by the name of God. God is superessential nothingness and transcendent being beyond all words and beyond all understanding. The best a man can do is remain silent, because any time he prates on about God, he is committing the sin of lying. The true master knows that if he had a God he could understand, he would never hold him to be God. Eckhart is also referenced in J.D. Salinger, Franny and Zooey. In a letter to Zooey, Buddy says, "I can't help thinking you'd make a damn sight better adjusted actor if Seymour and I hadn't thrown in the Upanishads and the Diamond Sutra and Eckhart and all our other old loves with the rest of your recommended reading when you were small." The third movement of John Adams's Harmonieler Symphony is titled Meister Eckhart and Quacky, which imagines the mystic floating through space with the composer's daughter Emily on his back whispering secrets of grace in his ear. The publication of the modern critical edition of Eckhart's German and Latin works began in 1936, and is nearly complete. One difficulty with Eckhart's Latin writings is that they clearly represent only a small portion of what he planned to write. Eckhart describes his plans to write a vast opus tripartitum.